Chapter 8, Religion. No people at the present day can be explained by their national religion. They do not feel responsible for it. It lies far outside of them. Their loyalty to truth and their labor and expenditure rest on real foundations and not on a national church. And English life, it is evident, does not grow out of the Athanasian Creed or the articles of the Eucharist. It is with religion as with marriage. A youth marries in haste afterwards when his mind is opened to the reason of the conduct of life. He is asked what he thinks of the institution of marriage and of the right relation of the sexes. I should have much to say, he might reply, if the question were open, but I have a wife and children, and all question is closed for me. In the barbarous days of a nation, some cultus is formed or imported. Altars are built, tithes are paid, priests ordained. The education and expenditure of the country take that direction, and when wealth, refinement, great men, and ties to the world supervene, its prudent men say, why fight against fate, or lift these absurdities which are now mountainous? Better find some niche or crevice in this mountain of stone, which religious ages have quarried and carved, wherein to bestow yourself, than attempt anything ridiculously and dangerously above your strength, like removing it. In seeing old castles and cathedrals, I sometimes say, as today, in front of Dundee Church Tower, which is 800 years old, this was built by another and a better race than any that now look on it. And plainly, there has been great power of sentiment at work in this island, of which these buildings are the proofs. As volcanic basalts show the work of fire which has been extinguished for ages, England felt the full heat of the Christianity which fermented Europe, and drew, like the chemistry of fire, a firm line between barbarism and culture. Power of the religious sentiment put an end to human sacrifices, checked appetite, inspired the Crusades, inspired resistance to tyrants, inspired self-respect, set bounds to serfdom and slavery, founded liberty, created the religious architecture. York, Newstead, Westminster, Fountains Abbey, Ripon, Beverley, and Dundee, works to which the key is lost, with the monkish histories, the Chronicle of Richard of Devizes. The priest translated the Vulgate and translated the sanctities of old hagiology into English virtues on English ground. It was a certain affirmative or aggressive state of the Caucasian races. Man awoke refreshed by the sleep of ages. The violence of the northern savages exasperated Christianity into power. It lived by the love of the people. Bishop Wilfrid manumitted 250 serfs, whom he found attached to the soil. The clergy obtained respite from labor for the poor on the Sabbath and on church festivals. Quote, the Lord who compelled his poor to labor between sunset on Saturday and sunset on Sunday forfeited him altogether. The priest came out of the people and sympathized with his class. The church was the mediator, check, and democratic principle in Europe. Latimer, Wycliffe, Arundel, Cobham, Anthony Parsons, Sir Harry Vane, George Fox, Penn, Bunyan are the Democrats as well as the saints of their time. The Catholic century is a massive system, close fitted to the manners and genius of the country, at once domestical and stately. In the long time it has blended with everything in heaven above and the earth beneath. It moves through a zodiac of feasts and fasts, names every day of the year, every town and market and headland and monument, and has coupled itself with the almanac, that no court can be held, no field plowed, no horse shod, without some leave from the church. All maxims of prudence, or shop, or farm, are fixed and dated by the church. Hence its strength in the agricultural districts. The distribution of land into parishes enforces a church sanction to every civil privilege, and the gradation of the clergy, prelates for the rich and curates for the poor, with the fact that a classical education has been secured to the clergymen, makes them, quote, the link which unites the sequestered peasantry with the intellectual advancement of the age. The English Church has many certificates to show of humble, effective service in humanizing the people, in cheering and refining men, feeding, healing, and educating. It has the seal of martyrs and confessors, the noblest books, a sublime architecture, a ritual marked by the same secular merits, nothing cheap or purchasable. From this slow-grown church, important reactions proceed, much for culture, much for giving a direction to the nation's affection and will today. The carved and pictured chapel, its entire surface animated with image and emblem, made the parish church a sort of book and Bible to the people's eye. Then when the Saxon instinct had secured a service in the vernacular tongue, it was the tutor and university of the people. In York Minster, on the day of the enthronization of the new archbishop, I heard the service of evening prayer read and chanted in the choir. It was strange to hear the pretty pastoral of the betrothal of Rebecca and Isaac in the morning of the world, read with circumstantiality in York Minster on the 13th January 1848 to the decorous English audience, just fresh from the Times newspaper and their wine, and listening with all the devotion of national pride. That was binding old and new to some purpose. The reverence for the scriptures is an element of civilization, for thus has the history of the world been preserved and is preserved. Here in England, every day a chapter of Genesis and a leader in the Times. Another part of the same service on this occasion was not insignificant. Handel's coronation anthem, God Save the King, was played by Dr. Camage on the organ with sublime effect. The minister and the music were made for each other. It was a hint of the part the church plays as a political engine. From his infancy, every Englishman is accustomed to hear daily prayers for the Queen, for the royal family and the Parliament by name. And this lifelong consecration cannot be without influence on his opinions. The universities also are parcel of the ecclesiastical system, and their first design is to form the clergy. Thus the clergy for 1,000 years have been the scholars of the nation. The national temperament deeply enjoys the unbroken order and tradition of its church, the liturgy, ceremony, architecture, the sober grace, the good company, the connection with the throne and with history, and with history which adorn it. And whilst it endears itself thus to men of more taste than activity, the stability of the English nation is passionately enlisted to its support, from its inextricable connection with the cause of public order, with politics, and with the funds. Good churches are not built by bad men. At least there must be probity and enthusiasm somewhere in the society. These ministers were neither built nor filled by atheists. No church has had more learned, industrious, or devoted men. Plenty of clerks and bishops who, out of their gowns, would turn their backs on no man. Their architecture still glows with faith in immortality. Heats and genial periods arrive in history, or shall we say, plenitudes of divine presence, by which high tides are caused in the human spirit, and great virtues and talents appear, as in the 11th, 12th, 13th, and again in the 16th and 17th centuries, when the nation was full of genius and piety. The age of the Wycliffes, Cophams, Arundels, Beckets, of the Latimers, Moores, Cranmers, of the Taylors, Laytons, Herberts, of the Sherlocks and Butlers is gone. Silent revolution and opinion have made it impossible that men like these should return, or find a place in their once sacred stalls. The spirit that dwelt in this church has glided away to animate other activities, and they who come to the old shrines find apes and players rustling the old garments. The religion of England is part of good breeding. When you see on the continent the well-dressed Englishman come into his ambassador's chapel and put his face for silent prayer into his smooth-brushed hat, you cannot help feeling how much national pride prays with him and the religion of a gentleman. So far is he from attaching any meaning to the words that he believes himself to have done almost the generous thing, and that it is very condescending in him to pray to God. A great duke said on the occasion of a victory in the House of Lords that he thought the Almighty God had not been well used by them, and that it would become their magnanimity after so great success to take order that a proper acknowledgment be made. It is the church of the gentry, but it is not the church of the poor. The operatives do not own it, and gentlemen lately testified in the House of Commons that in their lives they never saw a poor man in a ragged coat inside a church. The torpidity on the side of religion of the vigorous English understanding shows how much wit and folly can agree in one brain. Their religion is a quotation, their church is a doll, and any examination is interdicted with screams of terror. In good company, you can expect them to laugh at the fanaticism of the vulgar, but they do not. They are the vulgar. The English, in common perhaps with Christendom in the 19th century, do not respect power, but only performance. Value ideas only for an economic result. Wellington esteems a saint only as far as he can be an army chaplain. Mr. Bristol, by his admirable conduct and good sense, got the better of Methodism, which had appeared among the soldiers and once among the officers. They value a philosopher as they value an apothecary who brings bark or a drench, and inspiration is only some blowpipe or a finer mechanical aid. I suspect that there's in an Englishman's brain a valve that can be closed at pleasure as an engineer shuts off steam. The most sensible and well-informed men possess the power of thinking just so far as the bishop in religious matters, and as the chancellor of the exchequer in politics. They talk with courage and logic and show you magnificent results, but the same men who have brought free trade or geology to their present standing look grave and lofty and shut down their valve as soon as the conversation approaches the English church. After that, you talk with a box turtle. The action of the university, both in what is taught and the spirit of the place, is directed more on producing an English gentleman than a saint or a psychologist. It ripens a bishop and extrudes a philosopher. I do not know that there is more Kabbalism in the Anglican than in other churches, but the Anglican clergy are identified with the aristocracy. They say here that if you talk with a clergyman, you are sure to find him well-bred, informed, and candid. He entertains your thought on your project with sympathy and praise. But if a second clergyman come in, the sympathy is at an end. Two together are inaccessible to your thought, and whenever it comes to action, the clergyman invariably sides with his church. The Anglican Church is marked by the grace and good sense of its forms, by the manly grace of its clergy. The gospel it preaches is by taste are ye saved. It keeps the old structures in repair, spends a world of money in music and buildings, and in buying pagan and architectural literature. It has a general good name for amity and mildness. It is not in ordinary a persecuting church. It is not inquisitorial, not even inquisitive. It is perfectly well-bred and can shut its eyes on all proper occasions. If you let it alone, it will let you alone. But its instinct is hostile to all change in politics, literature, or social arts. The Church has not been the founder of the London University, of the Mechanics' Institute, of the Free School, or whatever aims at diffusion of knowledge. The Platonists of Oxford are as bitter against this heresy as Thomas Taylor. The doctrine of the Old Testament is the religion of England. The first leaf of the New Testament, it does not open. It believes in a providence which does not treat with levity a pound sterling. They are neither transcendentalists nor Christians. They put up no Socratic prayer, much less any saintly prayer for the Queen's mind. Ask neither for light nor right, but say bluntly, grant her in health and wealth long to live. And one traces this Jewish prayer in all English private history, from the prayers of King Richard to Richard of Devizes' Chronicle, to those in the diaries of Sir Samuel Romilly and of Haydon the painter. Quote, abroad with my wife, writes Pepys piously, the first time that ever I rode in my own coach, which do make my heart rejoice and praise God, and pray him to bless it to me and continue it. The bill for the neutralization of the Jews in 1753 was resisted by petitions from all parts of the kingdom, and by petition from the city of London reprobating this bill as, quote, tending extremely to the dishonor of the Christian religion and extremely injurious to the interests and commerce of the kingdom in general, and of the city of London in particular. But they have not been able to congeal humanity by act of parliament. Quote, the heavens journey still and sojourn not, and arts, wars, discoveries, and opinions go onward at their own pace. The new age has new desires, new enemies, new trades, new charities, and reads the scriptures with new eyes. The chatter of French politics, the steam whistle, the hum of the mill and the noise of embarking immigrants had quite put most of the old legends out of mind, so that when you came to read the liturgy to a modern congregation, it was almost absurd in its unfitness and suggested a masquerade of old customs. No chemist has proposed in the attempt to crystallize a religion. It is endogenous, like the skin and other vital organs. A new statement every day. The prophet and apostle knew this, and the nonconformist confutes the conformist by quoting the texts they must allow. It is the condition of a religion to require religion for its expositor. Prophet and apostle can only be rightly understood by prophet and apostle. The statesman knows that the religious element will not fail any more than the supply of fibrin and chyle, but it is in its nature constructive and will organize such a church as it wants. The wise legislature will spend on temples, schools, libraries, colleges, but will shun the enriching of priests. If in any manner he can leave the election and paying of the priest to the people, he will do well. Like the Quakers, he may resist the separation of a class of priests and create opportunity and expectation in the society to run to meet natural endowment in this kind. But when wealth accrues to a chaplaincy, a bishopric, or a rectorship, it requires moneyed men for its stewards, who will give it another direction than to the mystics of their day. Of course, money will do after its kind, and will steadily work to unspiritualize and unchurch the people to whom it was bequeathed. The class certain to be excluded from all preferment are the religious, and driven to other churches, which is nature's the medicatrix. The curates are ill-paid, and the prelates are overpaid. This abuse draws into the church the children of nobility and other unfit persons who have a taste for expense. Thus a bishop is only a surpliced merchant. Though his lawn I can see the bright buttons of the shopman's coat. Through his lawn I can see the bright buttons of the shopman's coat glitter. A wealth like that of Durham makes almost a premium on felony. Brougham, in a speech in the House of Commons on the Irish elective franchise, said, quote, "How will the reverend bishops of the other house be able to express their due abhorrence of the crime of perjury who solemnly declare in the presence of God that when they are called upon to accept a living, perhaps of £4,000 a year, at that very instant they are moved by the Holy Ghost to accept the office and administration thereof, and for no other reason whatever? The modes of initiation are more damaging than custom house oaths. The bishop is elected by the dean and prebends of the cathedral. The queen sends these gentlemen a congé d'élire, or leave to elect, but also sends them the name of the person whom they are to elect. They go into the cathedral, chant and pray and beseech the Holy Ghost to assist them in their choice, and after these invocations invariably find that the dictates of the Holy Ghost agree with the recommendations of the queen. But you must pay for conformity. All goes well as long as you run with conformists. But you, who are an honest man in other particulars, know that there is alive somewhere a man whose honesty reaches to this point also, that he shall not kneel to false gods, and on the day when you meet him, you sink into the class of counterfeits. Besides, this succumbing has grave penalties. If you take in a lie, you must take in all that belongs to it. England accepts this ornamented national church, and it glazes the eyes, bloats the flesh, gives the voice of stertorous clang, and clouds the understanding of the receivers. The English church, undermined by German criticism, had nothing left but tradition and was led logically back to Romanism. But that was an element which only hotheads could breathe in view of the educated class. Generally, it was not a fact to front the sun, and the alienation of such men from the church became complete. Nature, to be sure, had her remedy. Religious persons are driven out of the established church into sects, which instantly rise to credit and hold the establishment in check. Nature has sharper remedies also. The English, abhorring change in all things, abhorring it most in matters of religion, cling to the last rag of form and are dreadfully given to cant. The English, and I wish it were confined to them, but it is a taint in the Anglo-Saxon blood in both hemispheres. The English and the Americans cant beyond all other nations. The French relinquish all that industry to them. What is so odious as the polite bows to God in our books and newspapers? The popular press is flagitious in the exact measure of its sanctimony, and the religion of the day is a theatrical Sinai, where the thunders are supplied by the property man. The fanaticism and hypocrisy create satire. Punch finds an inexhaustible material. Dickens writes novels on Exeter Hall. Am I good? Check, check, 1, 2. Check, check, 1, 2. Yeah, Democrat. Lord Shaftesbury. Oh. Dickens. Lord Shaftesbury calls the poor thieves together and reads sermons to them. What the hell? What? Calls the poor thieves together and reads sermons to them, and they call it gas. George Borrow summons the gypsies to hear his discourse on the Hebrews in Egypt and reads to them the Apostles' Creed in Romany. Quote, "When I had concluded," he says, "I looked around me, upon me with a frightful squint. I looked around me, the features of the assembly were twisted, and the eyes of all turned upon me with a frightful squint. Not an individual present, but squinted. The genteel Peppa, the good-humored Chukurana, the Kazdami all squinted. The gypsy jockey squinted worst of all. The church at this moment is much to be pitied. She has nothing left but possession. If a bishop meets an intelligent gentleman and reads fatal interrogations in his eyes, he has no recourse but to take wine with him. False position introduces cant, perjury, simony, and ever a lower class of mind and character into the clergy. And when the hierarchy is afraid of science and education, afraid of piety, afraid of tradition, and afraid of theology, there is nothing left but to quit a church which is no longer one. But the religion of England, is it the established church? Is it the established church? No. Is it the sects? No. There are only perpetuations of some private man's descent, and are to the established church as cabs are to a coach, cheaper and more convenient, but really the same thing. Where dwells the religion? Tell me first, where dwells electricity, or motion, or thought, or gesture? They do not dwell or stay at all. Electricity cannot be made fast, mortared up, and ended, like a London monument or the tower, so that you shall know where to find it and keep it fixed, as the English do with their things, forevermore. It is passing, glancing, gesticular. It is a traveler, a newness, a surprise, a secret, which perplexes them and puts them out. Yet if religion be the doing of all good, and for its sake the suffering of all evil, souffrir de tout le monde, et ne faire souffrir personne. That divine secret has existed in England from the days of Alfred to those of Romilly, of Clarkson, and of Florence Nightingale, and in thousands who have no fame. Chapter 14, Literature. A strong common sense, which it is not easy to unseat or disturb, marks the English mind for 1,000 years, a rude strength newly applied to thought, as of sailors and soldiers who had lately learned to read. They have no fancy, and never are surprised into a covert or witty word, such as pleased the Athenians and Italians, and was convertible into a fable not long after. But they delight in strong, earthy expression, not mistakable, coarsely true to the human body, and those spoken among princes equally fit and welcome to the mob. This homeliness, veracity, and plain style appear in the earliest extant works, and in the latest. It imports into songs and ballads the smell of earth, the breath of cattle, and, like a Dutch painter, seeks a household charm, though by pails and pans. They ask their constitutional utility in verse. The kale and herrings are never out of sight. The poet nimbly recovers himself from every sally of the imagination. The English muse loves the farmyard, the lane and market. She says with Destale, I tramp in the mire with wooden shoes whenever they would force me into the clouds. For the Englishman has accurate perceptions, takes hold of things by the right end, and there is no slipperiness in his grasp. He loves the axe, the spade, the oar, the gun, the steam pipe. He has built the engine he uses. He is materialist, economical, mercantile. He must be treated with sincerity and reality, with muffins and not the promise of muffins. He prefers his hot chop, which, with perfect security and convenience in the eating of it, to the chances of the amplest and Frenchiest bill of fare, engraved on embossed paper. When he is intellectual and a poet or a philosopher, he carries the same hard truth and the same keen machinery into the mental sphere. His mind must stand on a fact. He will not be baffled or catched at clouds. The mind must have a symbol palpable and resisting. When he relishes in Dante, in the vise-like tenacity with which he holds a mental image before the eyes, as if it were a scutcheon painted on a shield. Byron, quote, liked something craggy to break his mind open. A taste for plain, strong speech, what is called a biblical style, marks the English. It is in Alfred and the Saxon Chronicle, and in the sagas of the Northmen. Latimer was homely, Hobbes was perfect. In the, quote, noble vulgar speech, Donne, Bunyan, Milton, Taylor, Evelyn, Pepys, Hooker, Cotton, and the translators wrote it. How realistic or materialistic in treatment of his subject is Swift. He describes his fictitious persons as if for the police. Defoe has no insecurity or choice. Hudibras has the same hard mentality, keeping the truth at once to the senses and to the intellect. It is not less seen in poetry. Chaucer's hard painting of his Canterbury pilgrims satisfies the senses. Shakespeare, Spenser, and Milton, in their loftiest ascents, have this national grip and exactitude of mind. This mental materialism makes the value of England transcendental genius in these writers and in Herbert, Henry, Moore, Donne, and Sir Thomas Browne. The Saxon materialism and narrowness, exalted into the sphere of intellect, makes the very genius of Shakespeare and Milton. When it reaches the pure element, it treads the clouds as securely as the adamant. Even in its elevations materialistic, its poetry is common sense inspired, or iron raised to white heat. The marriage of the two qualities is in their speech. It is a tacit rule of the language to make the frame or skeleton of Saxon words. And when elevation or ornament is sought, to interweave Roman, but sparingly, nor is a sentence made of Roman words alone, without loss of strength. The children and laborers use the Saxon unmixed. The Latin unmixed is abandoned to the colleges and Parliament. Mixture is a secret of the English island, and in their dialect, the male principle is the Saxon, the female the Latin, and they are combined in every discourse. A good writer, if he has indulged in a Roman roundness, makes haste to chasten and nerve his period by English monosyllables. When the Gothic nations came into Europe, they found it lighted with the sun and moon of Hebrew and Greek genius. The tablets of their brain, long kept in the dark, were finally sensible to the double glory, to the images from this twin source, of Christianity and art, the mind became fruitful as by the incubation of the Holy Ghost. The English mind flowered in every faculty. The commonest sense was surprised and inspired. For 2 centuries, England was philosophic, religious, poetic. The mental furniture seemed of larger scale, the memory capacious like the storehouse of the rains. The ardor and endurance of study, the boldness and facility of their mental construction, their fancy and imagination, and easy spanning of vast distances of thought, the enterprise of accosting of new subjects, and generally the easy exertion of power, astonish like the legendary feats of Guy of Warwick. The union of Saxon precision and Oriental soaring, of which Shakespeare is the perfect example, is shared in less degree by the writers of two centuries. I find not only the great masters out of all rivalry and reach, but the whole writing of the time charged with a masculine force and freedom. There is a hygienic simpleness, rough vigor, and closeness to the matter in hand in the second and third class of writers, and I think in the common style of the people, as one finds in the citation of wills, letters and public documents, in proverbs and forms of speech. The more hardy and sturdy expression may indicate that the savageness of the Norsemen was not all gone. Their dynamic brains hurled off their words as the revolving stone hurls off scraps of grit. I could cite from the 17th century sentences and phrases of edge not to be matched in the 19th. Their poets, by simple force of mind, equalized themselves with the accumulated science of ours. The country gentlemen had a posset or drink they called October, and the poets, as if by this hint, knew how to distill the whole season into their autumnal verses. And as nature, to pique the more, sometimes works up deformities into beauty in some rare Aspasia or Cleopatra, and as the Greek art wrought many a verse or column in which too long or too lithe, or nodes or pits and flaws are made a beauty of, so these were so quick and vital that they could charm and enrich by mean and vulgar objects. A man must think that age, well taught and thoughtful, by which masks and poems like those of Ben Jonson, full of heroic sentiment in a manly style, were received with favor. The unique fact in literary history, the unsurprised reception of Shakespeare, the reception proved by his making his fortune, and the apathy proved by the absence of all contemporary panegyric, seems to demonstrate an elevation in the mind of the people. Judge of the splendor of a nation by the insignificance of great individuals in it. The manner in which they learned Greek and Latin before our modern facilities were yet ready, without dictionaries, grammars, or indexes, by lectures of a professor, followed by their own searchings, required a more robust memory, and cooperation of all the faculties. And their scholars, Camden, Usher, Selden, Mead, Gattaker, Hooker, Taylor, Burton, Bentley, Bryan, Walton, acquired the solemnity and method of engineers. The influence of Plato tinges the British genius. Their minds loved analogy. were cognizant of resemblances and climbers on the staircase of unity. It is a very old strife between those who elect to see identity and those who elect to see discrepancies, and it renews itself in Britain. The poets, of course, are of one part, the men of the world of the other. But Britain had many disciples of Plato. More: Hooker, Bacon, Sidney, Lord Brooke, Herbert Brown, Donne, Spenson, Chapman, Milton, Crashaw, Norris, Cudworth, Berkeley, Jeremy Taylor. Lord Bacon has the English duality. His centuries of observations on useful science and his experiments, I suppose, were worth nothing. One hint of Franklin or Watt or Dalton or Davy or anyone who had a talent for experiment was worth all his lifetime of exquisite trifles. But he drinks of a diviner stream and marks the influx of idealism into England. Where that goes is poetry, health, and progress. The rules of its genius or its diffusion are not known. That knowledge, if we had it, would supersede all that we call science of the mind. It seems an affair of race or of meta-chemistry, the vital point being how far the sense of unity or instinct of seeking resemblances predominate. For wherever the mind takes a step, it is to put itself at one with a larger class, discerned beyond the lesser class, with which it has been conversant. Hence, all poetry and all affirmative action comes. Bacon, in the structure of his mind, held of the analogists, of the idealists, or, as we popularly say, naming from the best example, Platonists. Whoever discredits analogy and requires heaps of facts before any theories can be attempted has no poetic power, and nothing original or beautiful will be produced by him. Locke is as surely the influx of decomposition and of prose as Bacon and the Platonists of growth. The Platonic is the poetic tendency. The so-called scientific is the negative and poisonous. It is quite certain that Spencer, Burns, Byron, and Wordsworth will be Platonists, and that the dull men will be Lockists. Then politics and commerce will absorb from the educated class men of talents without genius, precisely because such have no resistance. Bacon, capable of ideas, yet devoted to ends, required in his map of the mind, first of all, universality, or prima philosophia, the receptacle for all such profitable observations and axioms as fall not within the compass of any of the special parts of philosophy, but are more common and of a higher stage. He held this element essential. It is never out of mind. He never spares rebukes for such as neglect it, believing that no perfect discovery can be made in a flat or level, but you must ascend to a higher science. If any, quote, if any man thinketh philosophy and universality to be idle studies, he doth not consider that all professions are from thence served and supplied. And this I take to be a great cause that has hindered the progression of learning, because these fundamental knowledges have been studied but in passage. He explained himself by giving various quaint examples of the summary or common laws of which each science has its own illustration. He complains that, quote, he finds this part of learning very deficient. The profounder sort of wits drawing a bucket now and then for their own use, and the springing head unvisited. This was the dry light which did scorch and offend most men's watery natures. Plato had signified the same sense when he said, all the great arts require a subtle and speculative research into the law of nature, since loftiness of thought and perfect mastery over every subject seem to be derived from some such source as this. This Pericles had, in addition to a great natural genius, for meeting with Anaxagoras, who was a person of this kind, he attached himself to him, and nourished himself with sublime speculations on the absolute intelligence, the imported thence into the oratorial art, whatever could be useful to it. A few generalizations always circulate in the world, whose authors we do not rightly know, which astonish and appear to be avenues to vast kingdoms of thought. And these are in the world constants, like the Copernican and Newtonian theories in Copernican and Newtonian theories in physics. In England, these may be traced usually to Shakespeare, Bacon, Milton, or Hooker, even to Van Helmont and Bayman, and do all have a kind of filial retrospect to Plato and the Greeks. Of this kind is Lord Bacon's sentence. That, quote, nature is commanded by obeying her. His doctrine of poetry, which, quote, accommodates the shows of things to the desires of the mind, or the Zoroastrian definition of poetry, mystical yet exact, apparent pictures of unapparent natures. Spencer's creed that soul is form and doth the body make. The theory of Berkeley that we have no certain assurance of the existence of matter. Dr. Samuel Clarke's argument for theism from the nature of space and time. Harrington's political rule that power must rest on land, a rule which requires to be liberally interpreted. The theory of Swedenborg, so cosmically applied by him, that the man makes his heaven and hell. Hegel, study of civil history, as the conflict of ideas and the victory of the deeper thought. The identity philosophy of Schelling, couched in the statement that, quote, all difference is quantitative, So the very announcement of the theory of gravitation, of Kepler's three harmonic laws, and even of Dalton's doctrine of definite proportions, finds a sudden response in the mind, which remains a superior evidence to empirical demonstrations. I cite these generalizations, some of which are more recent, merely to indicate a class. Not these particulars, but the mental plane or the atmosphere from which they emanate was the home and element of the writers and readers in what we loosely call the Elizabethan age. Say in literary history, the period from 1575 to 1625. Yet, a period almost short enough to justify Ben Jonson's remark on Lord Bacon, quote, about his time and within his view, were born all the wits that could honor a nation or help study. Such richness of genius had not existed more than once before. These heights could not be maintained, as we find stumps of vast trees in our exhausted soils, and have received traditions of their ancient fertility to tillage. So history reckons epochs in which the intellect of famed races became effete. So it fared with English genius. These heights were followed by a meanness and a descent of the mind to lower levels, the loss of wings, no high speculation. Locke, to whom the meaning of ideas was unknown, became the type of philosophy, and his understanding the measure in all nations of the English intellect. His countrymen forsook the lofty sides of Parnassus, on which they had once walked with echoing steps, and disused the studies once so beloved. The powers of thought fell into neglect. The later English want the faculty of Plato and Aristotle, of grouping men in natural classes by an insight of general laws, so deep that a rule is deduced with equal precision from few subjects, or from one, as from multitudes of lives. Shakespeare is supreme in that, as in all the great mental energies. The Germans generalize. The English cannot interpret the German mind. German science comprehends the English. The absence of the faculty in England is shown by the timidity which accumulates mountains of facts, as a bad general wants myriads of men and miles of redoubts to compensate the inspirations of courage and conduct. The English shrink from a generalization. They do not look abroad into universality, or they draw only a bucketful at the fountain of the first philosophy for their occasion, and do not go to the spring-head. Bacon, who said this, is almost unique among his countrymen in that faculty, at least among the prose writers. Milton, who was the stair or high table-land to let down the English genius from the summits of Shakespeare, used this privilege sometimes in poetry, more rarely in prose. For a long interval afterwards, it is not found. Burke was addicted to generalizing, but his was a shorter line, as his thoughts have less depth, they have less compass. Hume's abstractions are not deep or wise. He owes his fame to one keen observation, that no copula had been detected between any cause and effect, either in physics or in thought, that the term cause and effect was loosely or gratuitously applied to what we know only as consecutive, not at all as causal. Dr. Johnson's written abstractions have little value. The tone of feeling in them makes their chief worth. Mr. Hallam, a learned and elegant scholar, has written the history of European literature for 3 centuries, a performance of great ambition, inasmuch as a judgment was to be attempted on every book. But his eye does not reach to the ideal standards. The verdicts are all dated from London. All new thought must be cast into the old molds. The expansive element which creates literature is steadily denied. Plato is resisted, and his school. Hallam is uniformly polite, but with deficient sympathy. Writes with resolute generosity, but is unconscious of the deep worth which lies in the mystics, and which often outvalues, as a seed of power and a source of revolution, all the correct writers and shining reputations of their day. He passes in silence or dismisses with a kind of contempt the profounder masters. A lover of ideas is not only uncongenial, but unintelligible. Hallam inspires respect by his knowledge and fidelity by his manifest love of good books, and he lifts himself to own better than almost any of the greatness of Shakespeare, and better than Johnson he appreciates Milton. But in Hallam, or in the firmer intellectual nerve of Mackintosh, one still finds the same type of English genius. It is wise and rich, but it lives on its capital. It is retrospective. How can it discern and hail the new forms that are looming up on the horizon? New and gigantic thoughts which cannot dress themselves out of any old wardrobe of the past. The essays, the fiction, and the poetry of the day have the like municipal limits. Dickens, with preternatural apprehension of the language of manners and the varieties of street life, with pathos and laughter, with patriotic and still enlarging generosity, writes London tracts. He is a painter of English details, like Hogarth, local and temporary in his tints and style, and local in his aims. Bulwer, an industrious writer with occasional ability, is distinguished for his reverence of intellect as a temporality, and appeals to the worldly ambition of the student. His romances tend to fan these low flames. Their novelties despair of the heart. Thackeray finds that God has made no allowance for the poor thing in his universe. More's the pity, he thinks. But it is not for us to be wiser. We must renounce ideals and accept London. The brilliant Macaulay, who expresses the tone of the English governing classes of the day, explicitly teaches that good means good to eat, good to wear, material commodity, that the glory of modern philosophy is its direction on fruit, to yield economical inventions, and that its merit is to avoid ideas and avoid morals. He thinks it the distinctive merit of the Baconian philosophy in its triumph over the old Platonic, its disentangling the intellect from theories of the all fair and all good, and pinning it down to the making a better sick chair and a better wine way for an invalid. This not ironically, but in good faith, that, quote, solid advantage, as he calls it, meaning always sensual benefit, is the only good. The eminent benefit of astronomy is the better navigation. it creates to enable the fruit ships to bring home their lemons and wine to the London grocer. It was a curious result in which the civility and religion of England for 1,000 years ends in denying morals and reducing the intellect to a saucepan. The critic hides his skepticism under the English cant of practical, to convince the reason to touch the conscience is romantic pretension. The fine arts fall to the ground. Beauty, except as luxurious commodity, does not exist. It is very certain. I may say in passing that if Lord Bacon had been only the sensualist his critics pretends, he would never have acquired the fame which now entitles him to this patronage. It is because he had imagination. The leisures of the spirit, and basked in an element of contemplation out of all modern English atmospheric gauges, that he is impressive to the imaginations of men and has become a potentate not to be ignored. Sir David Brewster sees the high place of Bacon without finding Newton indebted to him, and thinks it a mistake. Bacon occupies it by specific gravity or levity, not by any feat he did, or by any tutoring more or less of Newton, etc., but as an effect of the same cause which showed itself more pronounced afterwards in Hooke, Boyle, and Haley. Coleridge, a Catholic mind, with a hunger for ideas, with eyes looking before and after to the highest bards and sages, and who wrote and spoke the only high criticism in his time, is one of those who save England from the reproach of no longer possessing the capacity to appreciate what rarest wit the island has yielded. Yet the misfortune of his life, his vast attempts, but most inadequate performings, failings to accomplish any one masterpiece, seems to mark the closing of an era. Even in him, the traditional Englishman was too strong for the philosopher, and he fell into accommodations. And as Burke had striven to idealize the English state, so Coleridge narrowed his mind in the attempt to reconcile the Gothic rule and dogma of the Anglican Church with eternal ideas. But for Coleridge and a lurking taciturn minority uttering itself in occasional criticism, oftener in private discourse, one would say that in Germany and in America is the best mind in England rightly respected. It is the surest sign of national decay when the Brahmins can no longer read or understand the Brahminical philosophy. In the decomposition and asphyxia that followed all this materialism, Carlyle was driven by his disgust at the pettiness and the cant into the preaching of fate. In comparison with all this rottenness, any check, any cleansing, though by fire, seemed desirable and beautiful. He saw little difference in the gladiators or the causes for which they combated. The one comfort was that they were all going speedily into the abyss together. And his imagination, finding no nutriment in any creation, avenged itself by celebrating the majestic beauty of the laws of decay. The necessities of mental structure force all minds into a few categories, and where impatience of the tricks of men makes nemesis amiable and builds altars to the negative deity, the inevitable recoil is to heroism or the gallantry of the private heart, which decks its immolation with glory, and the unequal combat of will against fate. Wilkinson, the editor of Swedenborg, the annotator of Fourier, and the champion of Hahnemann, has brought to metaphysics and to physiology a native vigor, with a Catholic perception of relations equal to the highest attempts, and a rhetoric like the armory of the invincible knights of old. There is in the action of his mind a long Atlantic roll, not known except in deepest waters, and only lacking what ought to accompany such powers, a manifest centrality. If his mind does not rest in immovable biases, perhaps the orbit is larger and the return is not yet. But a master should inspire a confidence that he will adhere to his convictions and give his present studies always the same high place. It would be easy to add exceptions to the limitary tone of English thought, and much more easy to adduce examples of excellence in particular veins, and if, going out of the region of dogma, we pass into that of general culture, there is no end to the graces and amenities, wit, sensibility, and erudition of the learned class. But the artificial succor which marks all English performance appears in letters also. Much of their aesthetic production is antiquarian and manufactured, and literary reputations have been achieved by forcible men whose relation to literature was purely accidental, but who were driven by tastes and modes they found in vogue into their several careers. So at this moment, every ambitious young man studies geology. So members of parliament are made, and churchmen. The bias of Englishmen to practical skill has reacted on the national mind. They are incapable of an inutility, and respect the five mechanic powers, even in their song. The voice of their modern muse has a slight hint of the steam whistle, and the poem is created as an ornament and finish of their monarchy, and by no means as the bird of a new morning which forgets the past world in the full enjoyment of that which is forming. They are with difficulty ideal. They are the most conditioned men, as if, having the best conditions, they could not bring themselves to forfeit them. Every one of them is 1,000 years old and lives by his memory, and when you say this, they accept it as praise. Nothing comes to the bookshops but politics, travels, statistics, tabulation, and engineering. And even what is called philosophy and letters is mechanical in its structures. In its structure, as if interpretation had ceased, as if no vast hope, no religion, no song of joy, no wisdom, no analogy existed anymore. The tone of colleges and of scholars and of literary society has this mortal air. I seem to walk on a marble floor where nothing will grow. They exert every variety of talent on a lower ground, and may be said to live and act in a sub-mind. They have lost all commanding views in literature, philosophy, and science. A good Englishman shuts himself out of 3/4 of his mind and confines himself to 1/4. He has learning, good sense, power of labor, and logic, but a faith in the laws of the mind like that of Archimedes, a belief like that of Euler and Kepler, that experience must follow and not lead the laws of the mind. A devotion to theory of politics like that of Hooker and Milton and Harrington, the modern English mind repudiates. I fear the same fault lies in their science, since they have known how to make it repulsive and bereave nature of its charm, though perhaps the complaint flies wider and the vice attaches to many more than to British physicists. The eye of the naturalist must have a scope like nature itself, a susceptibility to all impressions, alive to the heart as well as to the logic of creation. But English science puts humanity to the door. It wants the connection, which is the test of genius. The science is false by not being poetic. It isolates the reptile or mollusk it assumes to explain, whilst reptile or mollusk only exist in system, in relation. The poet only sees it as an inevitable step in the path of the Creator. But in England, one hermit finds this fact and another finds that, and lives and dies ignorant of its value. There are great exceptions of John Hunter, a man of ideas, perhaps of Robert Brown, the botanist, and of Richard Owen, who has imported into Britain the German homologies, and enriched science with contributions of his own, adding sometimes the divination of old masters to the unbroken power of labor in the English mind. But for the most part, the natural science in England is out of its loyal alliance with morals, and is as void of imagination and free play of thought as conveyancing. It stands in strong contrast with the genius of the Germans, those semi-Greeks who love analogy, and by means of their height of view preserve their enthusiasm and think for Europe. No hope, no sublime augury cheers the student, no secure striding from experiment onward to a foreseen law, but only a casual dipping here and there, like diggers in California prospecting for a placer that will pay. A horizon of brass of the diameter of his umbrella shuts down around his senses, squalid contentment with conventions, satire at the name of philosophy and religion, parochial and shop-till politics, and idolatry of usage betray the ebb of life and spirit. As they trample on nationalities to reproduce London and Londoners in Europe and Asia, so they fear the hostility of ideas, of poetry, of religion, ghosts which they cannot lay. And having attempted to domesticate and dress the blessed soul itself in English broadcloth and gaiters, they are tormented with fear that herein lurks a force that will sweep their systems away. The artists say nature puts them out. The scholars have become unideal. They parry earnest speech with banter and levity. They laugh you down, or they change the subject. The fact is, say they over their wine, all that about liberty and so forth is gone by. It won't do any longer. The practical and comfortable oppress them with inexorable claims, and the smallest fraction of power remains for heroism and poetry. No poet dares murmur of beauty out of the precinct of his rhymes. No priest dares hint at a providence which does not respect English utility. The island is a roaring volcano of fate, of material values, of tariffs and laws of repression, glutted markets and low prices. In the absence of the highest aims, of the pure love of knowledge and the surrender to nature, there is the suppression of the imagination, the priapism of the senses, and the understanding. We have the factitious instead of the natural, tasteless expense, arts of comfort, and the rewarding as an illustrious inventor whosoever will contrive one impediment more to interpose between the man and his objects. Thus poetry is degraded and made ornamental. Pope and his school wrote poetry fit to put round frosted cake. What did Walter Scott write without stint? A rhymed traveller's guide to Scotland. And the libraries of verses they print have this Birmingham character. How many volumes of well-bred metre we must jingle through before we can be filled, taught, renewed. We want the miraculous, the beauty which we can manufacture at no mill, can give no account of, the beauty of which Chaucer and Chapman had the secret. The poetry, of course, is low and prosaic, only now and then, as in Wordsworth, conscientious, or in Byron, passional, or in Tennyson, factitious. But if I should count the poets who have contributed to the Bible of existing England sentences, of guidance and consolation, which are still glowing and effective, how few. Shall I find my heavenly bread in the reigning poets? Where is the great design in modern English poetry? The English have lost sight of the fact that poetry exists to speak the spiritual law, and that no wealth of description or of fancy is yet essentially new and out of the limits of prose until this condition is reached. Therefore, the grave old poets, like the Greek artists, heeded their designs and less considered the finish. It was their office to lead the divine sources out of which all this and much more readily springs. And if this religion is in the poetry, it raises us to some purpose, and we can well afford some staidness or hardness or want of popular tune in the verses. The exceptional fact of the period is the genius of Wordsworth. He had no master but nature and solitude. He wrote a poem, says Landor, without the aid of war. His verse is the voice of sanity in a worldly and ambitious age. One regrets that his temperament was not more liquid and musical. He has written longer than he was inspired. But for the rest, he has no competitor. Tennyson is endowed precisely in points where Wordsworth wanted. There is no finer ear, nor more command of the keys of language. Color, like the dawn, flows over the horizon from his pencil in waves so rich that we do not miss the central form. Through all his refinements, too, he has reached the public a certificate of good sense and general power, since he who aspires to be the English poet must be as large as London, not in the same kind as London, but in his own kind. But he wants a subject, and climbs no mount of vision to bring its secrets to the people. He contents himself with describing the Englishman as he is, and proposes no better. There are all degrees in poetry, and we must be thankful for every beautiful talent. But it is only a first success when the ear is gained. The best office of the best poets has been to show how low and uninspired was their general style, and that only once or twice they have struck the high chord. That expansiveness, which is the essence of the poetic element, they have not. It was no Oxonian, but Hafiz, who said, "Let us be crowned with roses, let us drink wine, and break up the tiresome old roof of heaven into new forms." A stanza of the song of nature the Oxonian has no ear for, and he does not value the salient and curative influence of intellectual action, studious of truth without a by-end. By the law of contraries, I look for an irresistible taste for ornamentalism in Britain, for a self-conceited modish life made up of trifles, clinging to a corporeal civilization, hating ideas. There is no remedy like the oriental largeness that astonishes and disconcerts English decorum. For once there is thunder it never heard, light it never saw, and power which trifles with time and space. I am not surprised, then, to find an Englishman like Warren Hastings, who had been struck with the grand style of thinking in the Indian writings, deprecating the prejudices of his countrymen while offering them a translation of the Bhagavad. Might I, an unlettered man, venture to prescribe bounds to the latitude of criticism, I should exclude in estimating the merit of such a production all rules drawn from the ancient or modern literature of Europe, all references to such sentiments or manners as are become the standard of propriety for opinion and action in our own modes, and equally all appeals to our revealed tenets of religion and moral duty. He goes to bespeak indulgence to, quote, ornaments of fancy unsuited to our taste, and passages elevated to a tract of sublimity into which our habits of judgment will find it difficult to pursue them. Meantime, I know that a retrieving power lies in the English race, which seems to make any recoil possible. In other words, there is at all times a minority of profound minds existing in the nation, capable of appreciating every soaring of intellect and every hint of tendency, while the constructive talent seems dwarfed and superficial. The criticism is often in the noblest tone and suggests the presence of the invisible gods. I can well believe that I have often heard that there are two nations in England, but it is not the poor and the rich, nor is the Normans and Saxons, nor the Celt and the Goth. These are each always becoming the other. For Robert Owen does not exaggerate the power of circumstance, but the two complexions, or two styles of mind, the perceptive class and the practical finality class, are ever in counterpoise, interacting mutually, one in hopeless minorities, the other in huge masses, one studious, contemplative, experimenting, the other the ungrateful pupil, scornful of the source whilst availing itself of the knowledge for gain. These two nations, of genius and of animal force, though the first consist of only a dozen souls and the second of 20 millions, forever by their discord and their accord yield the power of the English state.